there seems to be a momentum behind a regionalization of supply chains, whereas they typically, especially in the hard goods manufacturing world, began on the manufacturer's floor in China and then spread to the rest of the world from there. Regionalization seems to be the way of the future.
Welcome to Rise and Stride, where we empower you to take your next step in an ever-changing business landscape. Here's your host, Denise LeDuc-Frumming, President and CEO of the California Society of CPAs.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rise and Stride. With me today is Tom Derry, CEO of the Institute for Supply Management, the first and largest not-for-profit professional supply management organization worldwide. Prior to his current position, Tom had been Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Association of Financial Professionals for 9 years, served as General Manager of the LexisNexis Business Intelligence Group, and has served on the boards of various organizations, including the Society of Human Resource Professionals, C-Stream Limited, and Heart Rhythm Society. With more than 30 years of experience in leadership and general management roles for public and nonprofit companies, Tom has executed turnarounds at the corporate and business unit level through acquisitions, divestitures, restructuring, and business process reengineering. Thank you, Tom, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Denise. What a pleasure to be invited.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So many great topics that we'll be covering.
Yeah, supply chain's been a little bit in the news of late.
It has been. I think I've heard supply chain referenced almost as much as new normal over the last 2 years and pivoting. So I think we heard that, many, many times. But supply chain surely is top of mind for many people.
Absolutely. For consumers, for sure. And really of interest lately, policymakers and lawmakers now are understanding some of the interdependencies we have globally and some of the implications for economic security and national security. So for a lot of reasons, supply chain is top of mind with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. It surely is. So maybe we can start out with just you telling us more about, do you say ISM? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, we're very proud of ISM's history. We're 107 years old, so we've been around quite a long time. And we're the world's largest and first professional society in our space. We've been certifying people as professionals in supply management since 1974, well over 60,000 people at this point. And we've witnessed the rise of supply chain, especially in the last 30 years, as a recognized professional discipline. When my colleagues in the 1980s were running the organization, which was then known as the National Association of Purchasing Managers, it really wasn't recognized as a professional discipline. Today, we've got 200 colleges and universities who offer graduate and undergraduate degrees in the field, so it really is established. And the era of globalization since the late 80s, early 90s until very recently was a major accelerator of the recognition of the need to professionalize that field. So it's been quite an exciting time for us in the field. And at the same time, ISM as an organization has a history of innovation that we're very proud of. We published the first set of ethical principles in the profession. We published something that was known as the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, at the request of the federal government prior to World War II, because the federal government, the president himself, realized that he didn't have reliable data on the performance of industry in the country, and he needed it to understand the direction and strength of the U.S. economy. And so a little anecdote that I'm proud of, we were asked to cease publication during World War II because the data was deemed to be too sensitive to our enemies during the conflict. And so
interesting.
Yeah, for a 4 or 5 year period, we ceased that publication and then we resumed and have been publishing it nonstop ever since. And as you're probably aware, it's very influential. It's followed closely by the capital markets. We privately brief the White House and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors every month prior to the official public release of the data, because they need to understand if and how the markets are going to react, because they do react to the data, and what that might mean for policy stances they need to take. So we're very aware of the influence and very proud of the influence we have there. We are now a digital first organization because we do have a global footprint. And so in order to meet the needs of our constituency globally, we have to be able to serve them through technology. So that's been a big part of our focus over the last 10 years during my tenure.
Mm-hmm. Well, the ethical component we surely can understand from a CPA perspective, because that's always front and center for us as well. But I really just interesting to hear the briefings that you have and just how supply chain has become more prevalent and something that we know is a critically important profession. And like we said, we realized that over the last 2 years as we saw so many different ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, whether it was personal protective equipment early on, right, when people were scrambling to protect themselves, but also their colleagues at the workforce. And there's some things that we've known because we're close to it. This is the world we live in, but maybe the general public was less aware of. Some surprising facts. 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that we use in our medicines here in the United States are sourced from China. And the raw materials behind those active pharmaceutical ingredients are typically sourced from India. That's the global supply chain for much of the pharmaceutical industry. And while that's led to more cost-effective medicines and drugs for all of us, for instance, there are some implications of that reliance on a country that's not always friendly to the United States, right? That have made people uncomfortable. We have a critical reliance on rare earth minerals, which is China has a de facto monopoly on the supply of rare earth minerals globally. And rare earth minerals, first of all, they're not rare in the sense that we normally think of. That's just a reference to the periodical table of elements. But people tend not to want to mine for them. But China's happy to mine for them. So we don't have those mines here in the United States, but we need those rare earth minerals for all the technology that we rely on in the business world and our family life and education, but also critically in military applications, right? And so people were becoming uncomfortable when they became aware of our strict dependence on certain locations and geographies and countries in the world and critical materials. Recently, semiconductors have been in the news. As we all know, Taiwan is the global hub of manufacturing for most semiconductors. And we are aware of the geopolitical situation between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. People in the PRC will object how I just characterized that relationship. And it's raised concerns about, a critical technology that underlies most of our economy in the Western world, actually around the total world, and potential insecurity that exists around that critical technology. So for many reasons, it's become something that's become top of mind for all of us. Consumers were aware of, unable to be getting household disinfectants in the early days of the pandemic, right? Because the surge in demand outpaced the ability to manufacture at that level of demand. Interestingly, in the early days of the pandemic, lumber was in short supply because new sources of demand were cropping up. All of us were upgrading our backyard decks, right, and building outdoor spaces, or we were building outdoor dining spaces for restaurants, right? But this was non-traditional demand that we had not anticipated. This is a very common supply chain issue when you've got new demand springing up, and the question is do we think it's real and long-lasting, and therefore do we invest in more manufacturing capacity, more sawmills in the case of lumber, to meet that higher level of demand that we deem to be permanent? Or do we think it's temporary? And is demand going to go back to its historical levels? And if so, companies are reluctant to make an investment, right? Because they're going to be leaving money on the table. So it's one of the reasons that we have these sort of expanding and contraction cycles in supply chain, because people are carefully evaluating, is what I'm seeing real or is it temporary? Do I need to plan for a permanent change in the conditions of my market, or is this something that's going to go away? Those are tough calls.
They are tough. And I did hear that 80%, the pharmaceutical piece. And I thought, because that just came up during the pandemic. Before, as long as everyone got their products, no one really had, any other thoughts on that. And so a question for you, because you bring up a kind of a conundrum, is how do you balance the cost piece in getting materials that are cost effective, and then also the reliance on one source for those products. And you said a lot of the technology is the lithium. I think it is from the mines, and a lot of those China has control of. So how do you balance that, and how are you helping your customers, your members, kind of look at that? Because it's a tough call.
It is a tough call, and you're absolutely right that the overwhelming imperative for the last 30 years has been driving the lowest total cost of ownership, right? And that's usually measured on a piece price or part price or component or an ingredient, right? Raw materials and so forth, electronic assemblies, all of those things. And while that was very important, especially in the early days, where, for instance, if your competitor stood up new operations in China or found a supplier in China and you weren't there yet, you were at a massive cost disadvantage. That was not sustainable. So it was all about cost and all of the other incidental costs. So the cost of transportation, right? Moving stuff by container ship across the Pacific Ocean, for instance, back to the United States, was so inconsequential relative to the cost savings of moving manufacturing. We didn't have to think about it. But that has completely changed since the pandemic. You're absolutely right. And there's been a critical mindset shift, which would have been almost heresy just 4 years ago. It's not a focus on total cost. Any chief procurement officer or chief supply chain officer today will tell you the number one mission is assurance of supply and protecting revenue, not keeping costs low. I know the head of the CPO of a large pharmaceutical firm who said, yeah, we forgot that there's an implicit price of risk with everything we buy, but we forgot to price it in. And boards and CEOs are now saying, if you can guarantee my supply, I don't suffer stockouts. The competition doesn't come in and take market share from me because they've got product on shelves and I do not. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic, by the way. That's more important to me, maintaining my market share and my market positioning, than a couple of percentages of margin. Well, I believe, is a more enlightened point of view, but it leads to a healthier ecosystem between buyers and suppliers as well. But it is a significant mindset shift from where we were just 2 years ago, no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a good point, the risks that are out there. And so how do business and finance professionals help kind of stay on top of some of those risks? What would be your advice to them?
It's a great question, and it's extremely timely because there's actually empirical evidence that the number of risk disruptions in supply chains is increasing compared to prior periods in history. And there are a number of factors for that. Climate change and more severe weather events create more risk disruptions. Actually, the impact of the pandemic on manufacturing operations has been such that people were so focused on production, they may have cut some corners, frankly, on some of their focus on safety. So we're seeing the incidence of fires in manufacturing it's 1,000 times what it was just 3 years ago around the world. So supply disruption has increased, no doubt about it. And we need to be ready for that. And there are a couple of things that you can do. You're absolutely right that the primary driver of supply chain strategy over the last 25 or 30 years was leveraging your spend volume and allocating as much of that to a single supplier as you could to get the lowest total price. Well, companies are saying we're not comfortable with the risk of that. I know many companies today are saying we're qualifying a second supplier. Qualifying a supplier, by the way, is a time-consuming and expensive process, so companies don't do that lightly. But in today's environment, so we're qualifying a second supplier and we're allocating a small portion of our volume to that second supplier. And that supplier typically is in a different geographic area, which is more immune to either geopolitical risks or climate risk or weather risk, whatever risk you kind of is top of mind for you. And it could be both. And now I'm in a position to allocate volume to that second supplier if I need to. The other thing that's happened that's been an accelerant to these changes was the imposition of tariffs by the Trump administration. As you know, the Biden administration has continued those tariffs against China. And I understand why they would do that, because you don't want to give up the leverage, whatever leverage you may have in thinking about the economic relationship there. But clearly, and ISM data backs this up, buying companies have either encouraged or required their suppliers either to stand up a second location outside of China or or they're finding a second supplier outside of China. And interestingly to me, a lot of evidence that ISM has collected that private companies in China have decided they'd rather have a second location in a tariff exempt country and not have to deal with those, because those tariffs, some of those tariffs are today at the 25% level, which would overwhelm the margins of many products in many companies. So there's been seismic change. Now, I don't want to indicate that it's happening rapidly, because supply chains, they took 30 years to evolve to the current state of maturity. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen over the next decade for sure. And we've already seen signs that northern Mexico in particular, in a sense, has become a beneficiary at the expense of China, that people are moving some high advanced manufacturing operations to northern Mexico because of proximity to the customer or proximity to the buyer. Aerospace and defense was already in a high state of maturity in terms of suppliers being based in northern Mexico. For the automobile supply chain, for instance, products and components move across the U.S.-Mexico border dozens of times in the process of being assembled and manufactured before they end up for final delivery, at a dealership in, Kansas City or wherever. But for the rest of the world, it's going to take some time to catch up. But there are clear incentives. You don't have the cost, the current high cost, the susceptibility to disruption, and the unpredictability associated with transporting freight by ocean, which has been a major concern. You can move product by rail if you need to, or if you move it by ocean, it's a short trip. You can move stuff overland by truck. Now we have a chronic trucking shortage, but still and we're not subject to tariffs. And there's just a lot of reasons why there seems to be a momentum behind a regionalization of supply chains, whereas they typically, especially in the hard goods manufacturing world, sort of began on the manufacturer's floor in China and then spread to the rest of the world from there. Regionalization seems to be the wave of the future, or we're going to see more Europe or EMEA-based supply chain, definitely an Asia-Pacific-based supply chain, and one that's possibly more North American, or maybe just call it Western Hemisphere-centric.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And so with all this change, as far as the supply chain, what do you see as technology, playing a part in this? Because technology to all of us is changing our worlds, and in some instances accelerating what we knew was going to happen anyway, right? And I think the pandemic did that for sure. But how do you see that technology? And we talked a little bit before about digital twins, which is near and dear to my heart because I was in the real estate world and we talked about that a lot. How do you see that and other technologies as kind of shifting where we're going in the future?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct about that. And as a general matter, supply chain managers are becoming the managers of data flows as much as they are the flow of goods, right? So you're tracking data associated with the cost of the part, where it's going for, where it will be incorporated into the final product, who the end customer likely is to be, the invoice price. All this data is flowing. You've got lot and manufacturing data, for quality assurance purposes. All this data is flowing now. Blockchain is facilitating some of that for some advanced companies. We have had a focus on automating well-established business processes in supply chain. So what we often refer to as source to pay or procure to pay in supply chain, which is kind of like placing the order to paying for the order, which is kind of one narrow segment of the end-to-end supply chain. That's been a process that's been automated for a better part of almost 2 decades. To a certain extent. Now we're moving into other areas where we're seeing the automation of contract lifecycle management, for instance, and demand forecasting. Something known as the bullwhip effect used to be a pretty little known outside of supply chain, but you increasingly hear references to the bullwhip effect because people understand that the way supply chains typically operate, if I'm looking to get a critical quantity to keep my production schedule up, and I'm on allocation from my supplier because that commodity is in short supply, I'm going to basically increase the level of my orders, trying to send a signal that my demand is increased and trying to get my supplier to provide me with more product. And that gets amplified at every stage of a supply chain, which can be 5 or 6 or 7 tiers deep. And so the bullwhip effect refers to small changes that indicate the demand signal at the top of the supply chain become massive variations at the base of the supply chain because everyone's overcompensating for what they perceive to be the demand signals further up the chain. Well, that's highly inefficient. And demand planning, or sometimes known as S&OP as a process, has come to the fore. And there's been a lot of work with machine learning to define algorithms that will help demand planners become much more accurate in forecasting demand, which is a massive benefit to all of us. It means we're not competing one company against another for scarce supply to the extent that we are. It also means our suppliers can more reliably kind of meet our demand signals and trust them. I heard a very interesting story in the automotive industry during the depths of the pandemic. As we all know, semiconductors are still in short supply. And this is a tier one automotive supplier who makes fairly sophisticated cameras and sensors for automobiles and trucks. So your backup cameras and your 360-degree lane change devices and all that stuff. And of course, they rely on semiconductors. And their major U.S. supplier was Texas Instruments. And Texas Instruments called up and said, first of all, you're on allocation like all of our customers. So you're not going to get 100% of your order because we can't fulfill it. So we're going to send you 40% or whatever it might be. And even before we do that, we want to see your order book with your customers, the automotive OEMs. Because unless there's a rational relationship between the orders you're fulfilling and the amount of product we're shipping to you, we're not sending it to you. In other words, they're auditing their customers' customers to manage the level of demand. Yeah. You don't hear that very often. That's why demand planning has become so crucial, and why technology, to the extent it can help us gain deeper insight into what actual demand signals are, is really important. And the concern we have about whether or not the U.S. or the global economy is in a recession or on the brink of a recession, there's a lot of debate around that topic right now. Seeing true demand signals is incredibly valuable in understanding. Now, we artificially increase demand here in the United States through a combination of fiscal and monetary policies as a response to the pandemic. Right? There's no doubt about that. And consumer spending behaviors changed. Right? We couldn't get a haircut, we couldn't dine out, we couldn't go on vacation. So we upgraded our computers, right, for the home office, for the kids for schooling, and we built a nice home office. We upgraded our kitchen appliances, and so we artificially spiked demand. So the question is, where is that demand going? It is clearly coming back down. Consumer spending behaviors are shifting back to more normal patterns between services and goods. But where's it going to settle? And if we could answer that question, it would give us major insight into how likely a recession is, how long it might last, how severe it is. I will tell you, from a manufacturer's point of view, the backlog of orders is still pretty high.
Is it?
Compared to historical norms.
Yeah.
But they can be canceled, right? If their customers' demand goes away, they'll cancel those orders. So we don't know how permanent that is.
It's hard to tell. The customer piece is just, you never know, right? We're fickle. We're very fickle, and change our minds, right?
Yeah.
As we need to.
And now in an inflationary environment, we're being a little more cautious about our spend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's changing patterns as well.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see where it all lands. Just on the digital twin, just what you're seeing there as far as the modeling, if you can just tell our audience.
Yeah, so it's a relatively new tool in our space, but the ability to model scenarios and kind of thread the needle ideally on what we do in supply chain. I guess at the most fundamental level is we're charged with kind of understanding the equilibrium point between the demand we're creating with our suppliers and the demand we're fulfilling with our customers. So we're literally sitting at the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Any ability to model changes in that equilibrium relationship, how demand may change based on new product introductions, and digital twins is really valuable in understanding how one product might perform against versus another in their attributes, is incredibly valuable to us. I would say it's early days for us in adopting that technology, but it is something that's coming up a lot in conversations in our space. We're going to have to be better at it. there's no doubt that supply chain is becoming more of a technical field where certain fundamental skills in data science and data analytics are necessary today that were not the case a few years ago. There's very sophisticated strategies about directing spend volume and negotiation and getting the right price and not engineering cost in. None of those things have changed. Stakeholder management, supplier relationship management, when you've got becoming a customer of choice, all those things that have been foundational to the best performing supply chains, they remain. But what's new is the ability to understand data, model data, and use that predictive ability to better manage, to anticipate risks, avoid risks, be more agile in responding than your competitors to risks, and then more efficiently managing your supply chain.
Mm-hmm. And that's something from a financial perspective, as you know, too, from your past. I mean, we've always been trying to do, right, the scenario planning, looking at where we think things are going and what's the model that we want to look at in particular for that point in time we're at. But then the shifting has become even more quickly than we've had to do in the past, right? In the past, you could anticipate you'd have maybe 6 months, a year and a half to shift. Now you have to do it in a month or two, which is, it's tough. As a CEO, it's really hard. How can you be agile enough to shift quickly and meet the market needs?
There's a particular point where finance and supply chain don't often see eye to eye, although in the last couple of years it's been the case. And that's an element of working capital, which is inventory, right? So supply chain managers will typically want to maintain some buffer stock, some safety stock, right? In the event that there's a disruption of the supplier and they can keep production rolling along. And your CFO will tell you, that's killing me. That's capital I can't redeploy elsewhere, right? But that conversation changed in the last couple of years, where everyone said, you know what? We're going to carry, and by the way, the vast majority of firms in the United States and around the world are intentionally carrying higher levels of inventory today than normally would back in the days of the preference for just in time, right? Lean practices. Now, some people ask me, have we permanently moved from just in time to just in case? And my answer to that is no, I don't think so. We're going to go back to those principles, which just make too much sense in the long run. But while the world is feeling very volatile and unpredictable, and it still is, I think, to many industries today, carrying higher levels of inventory is one of the ways you feel more comfortable about your stance than otherwise. But I think it's temporary. I think the long run trend is clear that lower and lower levels of inventory to maintain operations and free up free cash. And by the way, free cash flow is becoming increasingly an important metric in supply chain. Companies are looking not so much at traditional working capital metrics so much as what's the cash conversion cycle? How can I accelerate that? How can I move my inventory turns faster?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it will be interesting to see where it all balances going forward. It's a shifting world, that's for sure.
I think that the old calculations have permanently changed. Yeah.
They have, the perspectives. But I agree with you. I mean, things will shift back as we forget some of the past. You move into maybe some of your not old ways, but just changed ways of working.
We did not learn the lesson from. Remember the tsunami in Japan back in 2011, 2012?
I do. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we quickly forgot the lessons of geographic concentration. For a lot of reasons, there are a lot of incentives for suppliers and buyers to be physically close to one another because it improves innovation and minimizes lead times and shipping and all of that. But when you've got very dense clustering and then you have a geographic event like a tsunami, an earthquake, you realize the risk that is associated with that. That's why the regionalization of supply chains, I think, makes sense, because I might have an issue in Latin America, but it doesn't mean my entire global supply chain has gone down. I just have a problem in one place and it's a little more contained.
Mm-hmm. No, it does make sense. It'll be interesting to see where that goes too.
Yeah.
From that standpoint. So just a last question for you, because we always enjoy hearing stories from our guests of really their journey, and maybe a couple tips you have from a leadership perspective on, leaders out there, how they can make sure they're impactful and also make sure that they're ready for tomorrow and all the demands that we will have in front of us.
Well, I think I can boil that down to a few.
It could be an all afternoon
snippets.
conversation.
Yeah. Here's what I would say: never stop learning. Right.
Great.
When I came into this field, I didn't have deep domain expertise in supply chain, and as a result, I knew I had to immerse myself in the field quickly and deeply in order to kind of get up to speed, and a little paranoia around not knowing that you're talking to a room full of experts and you need to come across as credible is a healthy thing, I think. Make sure you hire great people, because you can't do everything, and you need them to fill in the gaps and make great decisions on your behalf and on the organization's behalf. Get comfortable with technology. I guess technically I'm in the later years of the boomer generation. I tell people I don't feel like a boomer, but anyway, I guess I am classified that way. So I understand how important technology is to my not-for-profit business, but it's not something I'm steeped in. So I need people with technical expertise. We launched our first enterprise SaaS software product about a year ago. It's an incredible product. And I came in with a bias of anything that, hey, we're not a technology company. Let's not try to become one. And quickly realized we're not one, but we need to be one if we're going to be successful in the future. So get comfortable with technology, hire great people, never stop learning. And I guess the last thing I would say is my own career has allowed me to spend a significant amount of time in many different corporate functions. I was in product management. I was in finance. I led a sales team. For a terrifying brief point of view, I was actually an interim CFO and ran our external audit. So they weren't going to let me get away with that for too long. But anyway, but I bring a kind of a rounded point of view, a holistic point of view, and understanding, at least to some degree, the interdependencies and trade-offs between various businesses, elements of your business, really enables you to make sounder decisions overall with the best interests of the company in mind. I don't come at it from a uniquely finance lens or a uniquely product lens, or even a marketing and sales lens. And they're going to be trade-offs among the disciplines. And so landing on the best answer, the best possible answer, even if it's not optimal from a particular discipline's point of view, and being able to articulate that, make the case, and get the buy-in from the team. So, yeah, okay, it's not what I would choose as CFO, but I get why we're doing it, and that we're all on board. That's a critical skill.
It is. And that diversity of perspective that you're talking about is so important. And then consensus, right? Everybody coming out of the room and saying, we all agree, even though it wasn't our first thought, we're going to move forward in this way. And I just was listening to McKinsey podcast this morning and said, it's just so important that everyone from the, whatever position you're in the organization understands where you're going. And they were talking specifically about a growth perspective, but understands where you're going. And you have that kind of buy-in, to your point, that's so important for the organization.
Yeah. And really something to watch out for, because I've seen it in cultures I've worked in the past. There can be sort of facially buy-in when the meeting is completed. And there are some people who are working behind the scenes maybe to undermine that decision. Cannot have that. Got to find out where that's happening, root it out. You will not be able to move ahead as an organization if you got people who are not fully on board, who are dissenting quietly behind the scenes. That's deadly for any business.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree 100% with that. You have to have everybody bought in, both in their words and how they carry out the message. It's so important.
Yeah.
Great tips. And I liked what you said too about hiring good people. When I first became a manager, the advice was hire people that are smarter than you. that was 20 years ago. And she said, that's a one tip I'm going to give you. And it's so true. You have to have those, and people that will tell you the truth too, because that's important. So this has been a fascinating, I could talk to you for another hour or two. So we don't have all that time, but we'll have to catch up another time when we're at an association event. Just really appreciated just all the tips you gave us and really the information about supply chain management, because as we said, that's top of mind for so many people. And just would encourage anyone to go to your website. I was on there. There's a lot of great articles. The Institute of Supply Management, ISM. Go there, and there's a lot of information to help you out as all the business and professionals move forward, kind of wrestling with this. Any last words that you want to give the audience, Tom?
I really appreciate the opportunity, Denise. And one of the things I tell my constituents is they have to be more savvy from a financial perspective if they were going to drive. That's how we keep score in business. And if you're going to drive results, so I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about the importance of building your financial acumen as a critical skill for supply chain managers.
Yeah. Who knows in the future? Maybe we'll have some other event together. You never know.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yep. Well, thank you again. Have a good day. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Rise and Stride is produced by the California Society of Certified Public Accountants. To learn more, visit calcpa.org.